It was a quiet Saturday morning in suburban Georgia, the kind of morning where the air felt light, the birds sang freely, and neighbors tended their lawns under the bright southern sun. The world outside seemed peaceful, but behind the walls of a neat brick home at the corner of Magnolia Lane, that peace was about to be shattered. Marcus Green stood at his kitchen counter, coffee mug in hand, scrolling through emails before heading out for a late morning jog. He was used to routine. Discipline had been carved into him by decades of service. But today, his uniform was folded neatly in his office upstairs, not because he'd retired, but because he was taking a rare weekend off. Marcus was no ordinary man. To his neighbors, he was quiet, polite, and always composed. But what most didn't know, or perhaps chose not to know, was that Marcus Green was the chief of police for the entire county. He had spent his life upholding the law, mentoring young officers, and fighting for a system that hadn't always fought for him. A black man in a leadership role in a town where power rarely looked like him, Marcus had learned to walk a careful line between firmness and diplomacy. That morning, he was sipping his coffee when he noticed two unfamiliar vehicles roll into his cul-de-sac. They weren't police cruisers, at least not official ones. His instincts immediately sharpened. The men stepping out of the cars wore dark tactical vests marked police. But something was off. Their uniforms lacked the precision of real law enforcement gear. Their posture, their movement, it all screamed performance rather than professionalism. Marcus placed his mug down slowly, his mind assessing every detail. A firm knock rattled his door a few seconds later. "Mr. Green, open up! We have a warrant for your arrest," one of the men shouted. The voice was rough, untrained, too casual for an officer. Marcus frowned, his heart steady but his jaw tightening. "A warrant?" he replied calmly. "On what grounds?" "You'll find out soon enough," the voice shot back. "Step outside with your hands visible." Marcus took a breath, his mind racing through possibilities. He hadn't violated any HOA rules, paid his dues on time, and maintained his property with precision. But he also knew how fragile some egos could be in neighborhoods like this, where authority was often misused and bias lingered behind polite smiles. He decided not to escalate. With calm precision, he opened the door just enough to see the faces of the men pretending to be officers. Their eyes met his. One looked away, unsure. "You said you have a warrant," Marcus stated firmly. "Show it to me," the taller man scoffed. "Sir, you're under arrest for non-compliance with HOA code, refusal to repaint your fence, and repeated violations regarding your driveway maintenance." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "Those aren't criminal violations," he replied. "And no HOA can send the police to arrest anyone. Who authorized this?" "Don't make this harder on yourself," the man barked. Marcus stared for a long moment, then quietly stepped back into his house and shut the door. He picked up his phone, dialed a direct line, and said two words that carried the full weight of command. "Code Black." Within minutes, real law enforcement vehicles began to converge quietly on Magnolia Lane. Outside, the two imposters were pacing nervously. The HOA president, a middle-aged man named Frank Miller, stood near his car, watching from a distance. He was the mastermind of this humiliation. For months, Frank had complained to anyone who would listen that man didn't belong in their neighborhood. He had filed frivolous complaints, sent nasty letters, and rallied other homeowners under the guise of maintaining community standards. But this time, he had gone too far. Frank had hired two off-duty security contractors, men with expired badges and too much arrogance, to intimidate Marcus into falling in line. What he didn't realize was that his plan was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. As Marcus watched from behind his curtains, real patrol cars arrived silently, parking at both ends of the street. The imposters froze as uniformed officers emerged, weapons holstered but eyes alert. One of the real sergeants called out, "Drop your fake badges and step away from the property." The confusion on the imposters' faces was instant. They tried to stammer explanations, but within minutes, both were disarmed, detained, and handcuffed. The HOA president's smug confidence evaporated as he saw Marcus finally step outside, calm, composed, and now wearing his real badge. Chief Green, the sergeant greeted with a nod of deep respect. Thank you, Sergeant, Marcus replied, his tone even. He turned his gaze toward Frank Miller, who now stood frozen near the curb. You wanted to see me arrested? He said quietly. Well, here I am. Frank opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face flushed red, his arrogance collapsing under the weight of realization. Marcus continued. You impersonated law enforcement. You tried to use fear to humiliate a man who spent his life upholding the very laws you thought you could twist. The sergeant nodded toward his men. Mr. Miller, you're under arrest for conspiracy and impersonation of a police officer, he said flatly. Frank's protests were drowned out by the clicking of handcuffs. Marcus stood silently as they were led away. The neighbors peeked from their windows, whispering, some in shock, others in silent approval. But Marcus didn't feel triumphant, he felt tired. Tired of proving his worth, tired of being tested in ways others never were. Still, there was pride, too. Pride that he hadn't let anger dictate his response. Pride that justice, real justice, had spoken for itself. That night, as the sun set and calm returned to Magnolia Lane, Marcus sat on his porch, his badge resting beside him. The streetlights flickered on, one by one, illuminating a neighborhood that had seen more truth in a single day than in years of polite silence. He thought about the irony of it all, how people could look at a black man and see only defiance instead of discipline, threat instead of leadership. But as he watched the stars appear, he smiled faintly. Let them learn, he whispered to himself. Let them see. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus Green allowed himself to exhale. The following morning, the story broke across local news stations. Fake officers arrested after attempted HOA raid. Victim turns out to be county police chief. The headline spread quickly, capturing both outrage and disbelief. Reporters camped outside the neighborhood, eager for comment, while the HOA scrambled to distance itself from Frank Miller's actions. But the damage was done. Marcus had spent his entire career navigating delicate situations, community unrest, racial profiling cases, moments where the system cracked under the weight of its own bias. But this was personal. It wasn't about a stranger or a suspect. It was about being targeted in his own home, in his own community, for the color of his skin. He received calls from officials across the state, some expressing shock, others embarrassment. The mayor reached out, offering support. Yet Marcus declined interviews. He didn't want to fan flames. He wanted to start a conversation, a real one. A few days later, at a town hall meeting, he stood before a packed room. Cameras lined the back wall, journalists scribbling notes as residents filled every seat. Some faces were familiar, some avoided his eyes. He began slowly, his voice steady but filled with quiet conviction. What happened on Magnolia Lane wasn't just an isolated act of ignorance, Marcus said. It was the result of something deeper, a mindset that still exists in too many places. Even in 2025, a belief that some people's presence must be justified while others is simply assumed. The room was silent. Every word landed with weight. I've worn this badge for 25 years, he continued. I've seen good men and women do extraordinary things to protect our communities. But I've also seen fear of difference, fear of losing control, turn neighbors into enemies. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience. The men who came to my door wore fake uniforms. But what's more dangerous than a fake badge, he said softly, is a fake sense of superiority. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Marcus didn't speak with anger. He spoke with clarity. He talked about what justice truly meant, not just enforcing laws, but building trust. We talk about protecting property, maintaining order, preserving image, he said. But what about protecting dignity? What about maintaining respect? When he finished, the room erupted into quiet applause. Not loud, not theatrical, but genuine. People stood, not because they were told to, but because something in them stirred. That night, his words spread across social media. Clips from his speech were shared thousands of times. The comment sections were filled with both outrage and admiration. For many, Marcus had become a symbol of quiet strength, proof that dignity could stand tall even in the face of blatant injustice. A week later, Marcus returned to work. His colleagues greeted him with a standing ovation, but he simply smiled and said, "Let's get back to it." There was no room for bitterness in his heart, only resolve. He had spent too long fighting for a system he believed could be better, and he wasn't about to stop now. Months later, as the HOA scandal unraveled further, new policies were introduced across several neighborhoods in the county. Training sessions were mandated to prevent racial bias in community enforcement, and stricter legal consequences were placed for impersonating law enforcement. Marcus quietly advised from behind the scenes, making sure the change wasn't just performative, but lasting. One evening, as he drove home from the station, Marcus took the longer route, passing through Magnolia Lane. The houses looked the same, but something in the air had changed. Neighbors waved more openly now. Conversations happened that once never did. The illusion of superiority had cracked, and through that crack, humanity had begun to shine through. As he parked his car and stepped onto his porch, the faint laughter of children echoed down the street. He looked around, the same lawns, the same fences, but now everything felt different. Inside, his uniform hung in the hallway, neatly pressed. But next to it was something new, a framed photograph of his town hall speech, signed by his officers with a single inscription below it. "Justice wears no color." Marcus stood there, quiet for a long time, before whispering, "That's the badge that matters most." And as the night descended once more on Magnolia Lane, the chief of police, once the target of ignorance, sat in peace, knowing that even in the face of prejudice, truth, dignity, and courage would always find their way to light.